to go on her 20, at 91, she's getting ready to go on to her 20th cruise. She's very excited. She told me that she drives everywhere independently, that she has 5 children, that her husband passed away 17 years ago. And every time she mentioned her husband, she would pause and talk, just kind of like think, you could tell she was thinking about him. She said they'd traveled all over the place. They've been to Bermuda 3 times. She loves St. Petersburg. She was just there. And as she was going on and on, her reward this morning is because she had some blood work. And so she was getting herself a fun sandwich at Panera's. And as I was listening to her talk, it was such a reminder from the universe that aging is not a monolithic experience. I have friends that are in their 40s and 50s that probably could not keep up with Maggie at 91. And so what was so poignant for me as well is that as a healthcare provider and as a clinician, I spent a little over 10 years in long-term care, assisted living, some hospice, and in the geriatric space specifically. And I was seeing people really at the end of these incredibly full lives. And because of institutionalized care, oftentimes it becomes that, we forget all their individual stories and histories. And, we start to, I don't want to say we intentionally treat them differently, but it becomes a different way of living. And so to see Maggie out there and be reminded that as a clinician, first and foremost, it was very powerful for me. Second, both my mom and dad have now passed. My mom passed right around 61. She had breast cancer that metastasized to her brain, and she loved to travel. My father had dementia. He passed away last year, and his experience, he did not like to travel, but we also wanted him around, with us, making memories that we would have to cherish beyond just thinking of him sitting in a chair and kind of fading away. And so whether it was from the healthcare provider side or for me personally, and knowing the differences that went into what traveling well and honoring their wishes looked like, as well as the family wishes. This was just a really touching and an important reminder for me as I come in today with this conversation, because I know that when we think about traveling, particularly after what happened for the past 2 years, fear seems to be what there's a lot of fear, of all the things that could go wrong. And when we talk about all the things that can go wrong, sometimes we find ourselves just thinking it's not worth it. And that, I'm just better sitting at home. And I have a friend who told me one day, well, I have Discovery Channel and I can watch, I can watch the reefs in high definition television. Why would I want to put myself out there and have to deal with this? And I'm just like, wow, is that where we've gone, in the virtual world? And I guess for some that's okay. But for me, I still want to be out there. And I think a lot of people do want to be out there living life, not sidelining themselves because of preconceived concerns or worries or fear. But there are logistical challenges, and it doesn't matter where you are on that timeline of life. We have to be mindful of our environment. And so what can we do to have the best opportunity for success while we're out on the road? And so I see some of these on the chat. I don't know if that's for me. I just want to double check. But I know I think we're going to take questions if throughout, if it's relevant to what I'm kind of covering at the moment. So I think I'm good right now. So I have really 3 parts that I want to break this up into. And I would welcome the comments as you're going. I can't read them as we're going though. So I think they're going to just let me know if they need to bring the question in. There's 3 basic strategies or ways that I look at traveling well. One, it's defining our why, what we're trying to do, and make sure that we all are on the same page of why we are traveling. I then like to talk about the what travel looks like, because this is very different for people. As I just shared with that story with Maggie, my dad, and my mom, Maggie is not holding anything back and apparently has the health and the ability and the agility, mobility to be able to just get out there and go. When my mom was post-cancer, wasn't quite the same. And it was definitely not the same with my dad and dementia. So I don't like to start with how first. Because as I said, there's so much fear and there's so much confusion. I find that if we dig into the how first, that we end up convincing ourselves it might not be worth it, and we might be playing smaller than we want. So I like to start with why, then I go into the what, and then I go into how. And at the very end of this, I have just a few slides that kind of break down how I process the how. It just gets a little bit more granular to the things that I would be looking for within the travel health and wellness space. So I'm going to get something to drink real quick. All right, why? When I talk to people about why they're traveling, I mean, you know, Maggie was just so impressive because she loves to be out there. You could just see her light up. The idea of being out there. She was so excited to be going to Portland, Maine. And then she was going to Nova Scotia. And she was going to go when she could watch the leaves change. And you could just feel the energy in her change as she talked about being out there, feeling it, independence, that sense of, you know, it was almost like the sense of wonder was still there with her, even though she's been, you know, this will be her 20th cruise. And so understanding why we want to get out there, I think, is key. Because I know for me, as I told you, my dad had dementia. We didn't know that this was coming. It truly happened like out of the blue. And I feel kind of bad as a healthcare provider that we didn't have a better understanding. But he didn't have a traditional dementia. He had apparently incredibly severe sleep apnea. And since he was single, we didn't really know it. You know, as daughters, we weren't living with him. And we started to get an understanding how bad it was getting because he had like a sudden shift in his mental status. It wasn't something that came on. You could talk to him about the Steeler game. He knew the sports scores. He was keeping up with the news. He could tell you like all the cognitive things that you would think of he had. We knew he was having a little problem with problem solving, but, you know, my dad had never been a tech wizard. And so it didn't seem like anything important, but he had like a sudden change. And we had taken him to the emergency department and found out that he was basically going hypoxic. So in the process of trying to get sleep apnea resolved, because he didn't know he had a problem with it, everything kind of fell apart. And so he ended up with this dementia, cognitive impairment that was kind of brought on, maybe with some other things going on, and this triggered it, made it worse. But anyway, it was pretty quick for us. And so we wanted to take a family vacation. And as I said, my dad didn't really like to travel. And so our why, when we talked to him, is we were like, Dad, you know, this is important for all of us. And he could reason, he could understand why we were saying it. So it's not like we were forcing him to go with us. And he's like, I just don't quite understand why. He's like, you know, for me, he was like, you know, I like the beach, but, you know, it's going to end up slowing you guys down. And I don't want to be in your way. And, you know, you'll have more fun without me. But for my sister and I, our why for wanting him there was for my niece and nephew who were younger at the time. And I said, what about them? And for us, you know, we know where this path is going to go. It's probably not going to be pretty. He was a pharmacist as well, very analytical thinking. I said, it's not going to be pretty, but wouldn't it be great for us to have some of these memories from still being at the beach? We love these beach vacations. We can kind of put this on the back burner and let's just go and have fun. If we fast forward the 4 years later, when he was really declining last year and he passed away, my niece now at 17 has a picture of Gigi on the wall. And it's a picture of them like on a back porch of this beach house. And she still will speak about him, you know, and be sad that he's gone, but then immediately goes, but I still remember sitting on the back porch with him watching the dolphins, which is exactly what we wanted. Yes, she misses Gigi, but her memories are not focused purely on what he was in those final years. She remembers going to the beach and having the experience with the dolphins. So that is why I like to tap into why. So whether it's multi-generational travel, whether it's bucket lists, whether it was my mom wanting to take her 3-year-old grandchild to Disney for the first time, even though she was 1 week out of her last of like 9 months of cancer treatments, which kind of terrified my sister and I the whole way through. Tapping into why you want to put forth the effort really makes any of the effort make sense, right? Because if we hear it all the time in like positive thinking, if our why is big enough, you know, we can overcome most anyhow. And I feel that this is really important, particularly if there's a lot of complexity within the travel experience. So that's one of the reasons why I like to start with why. Next, I like to, I'm transitioning over into the what. What is travel to you? And that is an important thing to understand. And it's why I like so much about being a patient advocate or an independent patient advocate. I don't have to meet anybody else's agenda. I can talk to a person and be like, what do you want? And what do you want that to look like? I don't have to meet somebody else's metrics or expectations. It's one-on-one with the client and the family, if that's who they want to bring in. And so what does someone's travel experience look like? Maggie apparently has absolutely no problem getting on cruise ships, which I love because I think cruising is fun. I could not have ever got my dad on a cruise ship. He didn't want to go near an airplane, but he loved a battlefield. So to him, traveling was a road trip and stopping at battlefields. Maggie is out there living large on cruise ships. My mom loved to travel around the world. She worked for an airline. So she was like, put me on a plane, send me anywhere. But as my dad's dementia progressed, travel was no longer getting out of the car at a battlefield. It might have been going to lunch and driving through the battlefield. And he still felt like he was traveling. It might have been to go look at the leaves change. It might have just been a simple 2-hour car trip. We still had to put in some strategy to achieve even that smaller goal. So clearly defining what the travel experience is going to look like, and then making sure that everybody understands the plan. And I think it was beautiful when we took my father to the beach, because this was a little bit earlier in his dementia. I mean, it was a little bit like herding cats. We traveled, it was a total of 3 families, a family that is not related to us. They has a husband and wife with 3 children, and at the time they were under 8. It was my husband and I, and then my sister's family with her 2 children. We stayed in a big beach house, and we had all talked with my dad, just to prep everybody. Dad's going to have his own suite. He's going to have his own bathroom. He has an elevator. There's, it's all going to, Dad knew exactly what to do. And then all of us, the rest of us, the families, we all kind of coordinated a strategy to where at some point someone always had eyes on Gigi. And it wasn't that my dad couldn't get around, but, as I had said, he could remember anything, but he couldn't problem solve. And so we wanted to just make sure that we didn't end up in a situation where he felt like he was, we were increasing confusion or putting him in a situation where he felt like everybody was going to be like hovering. We didn't want him to feel that. And so someone had their eyes on Gigi, but it wasn't all of us at any given time. And this also allowed the others that weren't kind of hanging out with him, because he was a super fun person, the other people who weren't right there with him, to be able to go out and have the experience that they wanted. And so my sister would joke around and say, tag, you're it. And we would kind of swap off, and somebody else would sit on the back porch or have lunch with them. And in that way, our travel experience was very clearly defined. And so again, start with your why. It'll help you overcome any of the logistical challenges, at least the mindset piece. What is super important to make sure everybody's on board. And then we go into the how. What does it look like when you are traveling? And again, this is, what defines a senior? I mean, I don't even know anymore. I'm 53, and I'm actually just buying a house in a senior community because I travel a lot, and I like the idea that somebody's going to be able to watch my house when I'm out on the road, or actually I live on my boat part-time. And so the next piece is more how. I'm going to stop there and see if does anybody have any questions about why and what before I go into how.
Folks, again, use that chat button. You can type any questions that you have for Andrea in the chat box.
Don't see any yet. Everything looks pretty good. All right. Feel free to ask if you have anything. I'll be happy to pop in here and look at that. I am going to show a few slides. I do not want to do death by PowerPoint. I have a problem with that, particularly as former faculty. Oh my gosh, I know we can really get lost in the weeds. But I did want to break down the how a little bit more because, and I think that as you look at the how, you might understand why I don't start with how, because the granularity of it and the complexity of it, depending on an individual's circumstances, can look very overwhelming. And that's why I like to start with why and what, and also build in a sense of humor. If this is something that looks like it's going to be, a lot of heavy lifting, because I think that sense of humor and remembering that, perfection is not the goal, because it won't ever look perfect. And it just helps us, all breathe through and actually have some fun while we're trying to get out there and do this. So I am going to share my screen here. Give me just a moment. All right. So when I think of how, and if I talk to folks about traveling, and again, this applies, I don't care where you are on that timeline. I look at it as basically three parts. Our mindset, and that kind of taps into that how and why, the why and what that I already talked about. There's our body, what we're bringing to the table, our baseline fitness, our abilities, our preferences, and then safety. And safety is really broad and all encompassing. So I will speak just briefly about that as we go. And here I can actually show you a little bit more. Let's see if I can move that around. Within safety, situational awareness, skills, and ability, I'm traveling, like I said, right now. I'm a solo traveler. There's a lot of senior solo travelers. So being aware of your environment. I was in the elevator the other day. It was kind of sweet. There was a grandmother and her granddaughter were in the elevator. We were all getting off on the same floor. And the little girl looked at me and she was like, oh, you're on our floor. That's neat. And the grandmother was like, you're talking to a stranger. I was like, because I was carrying a lot of stuff. And I was like, oh no, that's fine. And the little girl just looked at me and she goes, what room are you staying in? And her grandmother was like, we don't ask people what rooms they're staying in. And I was like, it's fine. And not that I told her, but obviously that's a benign experience, it is what it is. But if you are traveling, understanding where you're going and being attuned to your environment. I'm actually staying in the community I used to live in here when I was in Connecticut. So this is like my backyard. I used to drive by this hotel every day. I know what restaurants are here. I know where the grocery store is. I know where the hospital is. I know where to go and not to go with respect to the city. I also have what I perceive to be at least reasonable skills and ability when it comes to safety. I've been traveling for decades, pretty much been traveling for 45 years. And sometimes some of that was independent when I was a child. And so I feel, but these are things that I like to remind people, if you're a novice traveler, if you're not sure where you're going to a new city, maybe language barriers exist, we have to be mindful of our safety. As I mentioned, our body, I like to remind people, what you bring to the table it matters. Baseline physical health and wellness, and then this also includes any chronic illnesses or comorbidities or disease states that somebody might have. And then do they need some kind of special, services, coordination of care, medications, oxygen, dialysis on the go, different things like that, or things that we just like to have before we get out on the road. We just need to make sure that we can meet the needs of whoever's traveling. And again, if you're doing multi-generational travel, it's not just, the seniors, it could be the toddler that's traveling with you. You may have a senior with dementia and you may have a toddler with a peanut allergy. And so somewhere in between all that is trying to be managed. And then there's that mindset, the perceptions and the expectations, like I said. And I love to make sure to remind folks to try to have a little bit of a sense of humor about it, especially if you're traveling with groups, because as I mentioned, perfection does not exist. Things will go wrong. And, we're just trying to mitigate the severity of it so that you end up with a great story, because, the greatest stories ever told always have a little bit of chaos in them. However, we don't want it to be something that just truly negatively impacts your experience. And I think by understanding our perceptions and expectations, setting that clearly at the beginning helps everyone understand their role, whether they're the traveler, the senior, or, support individuals along the way. So that's kind of how I approach traveling well. Within pre-travel planning, and I think right here you can see again why I don't like to dive into how immediately. It can be incredibly overwhelming. You're dealing with itineraries, duration, the travel style, the time of the travel, any activities along the way, health status, vaccination status now, particularly with COVID. But we always had some concern with vaccinations if you were doing international travel, whether it be for hepatitis, pneumonia, if you were older, and for some younger folks, yellow fever, previous travel experience, and then special circumstances, like pregnancy, breastfeeding. And again, intergenerational travel, you could have people doing this. It's not just within the senior group. But, within, and this is all stuff we think of before we start to travel. And I can tell you, it can be a lot. In late May and up through the middle of June, I spent a month on the road, 1 week in Tennessee with my sister, and then we spent over 2 weeks in Hawaii. We did 4 islands in 14, 15, something like, it was 14, 16 days. I can't remember. And we had, was it 7 people? I'm kind of blanking right now. And, we all have different expectations. I can be kind of fastidious and I want the hotels to look a certain way. We had, helicopter excursions and scuba diving adventures, volcanoes and bike riding. And so while, technically, unless I count myself as the elder stateswoman of the group, not a senior per se, but there's a lot of coordination, particularly with COVID kind of over the top. And so making sure that we were able to do this seamlessly and have everything work to the best as we could, I tapped into making sure that I understood all these different pre-travel planning needs. Traveler touch points. And as I said, we just used 4, I'll just use Hawaii as an example, 4 different islands, between 14, 16 days, different people going different directions. When you're thinking of your health and wellness, you're looking at your transit, your lodging, dining, and then the different activities in the events that you participate in. And so, depending on the need of the individual, transit, the first day when we left Tennessee to go to Hawaii, we were up at 4 a.m. to get to the airport, and we did not go to sleep for 26 hours. It was, nobody in the group felt good. But the reason that happened that way is we left Tennessee and got to Hawaii. Everything went smooth with the flights. It was pretty much, unheard of right now, but we had no cancellations. We landed in Hawaii at around 3:30, but we had planned a snorkel with the manta rays that night. So we landed. By the time we got the rental car, we got to the Airbnb, we grabbed dinner, and we had to get on a boat. And so at 8 o'clock at night, we're out in the Pacific Ocean snorkeling with manta rays in the dark. And, by the time we got back to the inn, it was close to midnight. And that can take a toll on people. I don't care what age you are. And so being mindful of all these different traveler touch points can really impact positively or negatively your experience. Does somebody have a question? I heard somebody talking.
I think it was just some feedback.
Okay. Perfect. And so, the transit aspect of it, super long flights, depending on your health and your abilities. Some people may be at an increased risk of blood clots or cramping. I've heard, like some problem solving that goes kind of sideways sometimes. Let's say a person has, they go to the bathroom frequently for whatever reason, right? It could be somebody with prostate issues or, a bladder situation. And you think about logistics, and somebody might think, oh, well, I'm just not going to drink as much water because I don't want to have to pee all the time. Well, unfortunately, that can lead to dehydration and, potentially an increased risk in, again, blood clots, depending on if other things are going on. And so you have to look at all the different touch points within the context of what the person brings to the table with their health, wellness, mental status, or mental health as well. And then break it down even more granularly into transit, lodging, dining, and then those activities. I see the chat here. Would you suggest using airport travel assistance for most seniors with mobility and safety concerns, even families? You know what? I love the idea of using transfer services. You have to be very proactive. Should families consider taking a private caregiver? Okay, two great questions. And I am going to jump in here. I love these questions. And I think that this is very relevant. The first question being, would you suggest using airport travel assistance for mobility and safety? Absolutely, if you can get it booked. I think this is one of those things where use the services that the airlines provide. Right now, with everything that's going on in travel, I don't know how early you would have to coordinate that. I'd say the earlier the better. Make sure that you have that you look into it, because that everybody's having staffing issues and challenges and getting people around, and the airports are just packed. In part because a lot of the flights are delayed and people just seem to be like at the airport. So making sure that you can build in some extra time, for mobility. I'd look for as direct a route as possible to reduce the impact of flight cancellations. However, for some people, it might be better to break up a long trip. Maybe going from North Carolina to Hawaii might be too much for someone. So maybe in that case, it's better to do a multi-leg trip. But I do think that it makes sense to use whatever services are available that offer support. I was reading an article that airlines are training their employees on how to better serve individuals on the autism spectrum. And so being able to communicate and recognize potential signs of overwhelm and how to just make that more seamless. And I have to tell you, I think that it's going to be interesting as we watch individuals on autism spectrum age, because my sister and I have a strong feeling that my dad probably was on the spectrum. And I don't know, whoever would have diagnosed that back in the 1940s. But it will be interesting for people that are now diagnosed, to see how they age and what ends up changing for them along the way. And so, yes, I do believe using the services, if you can get them. I also love the question about, do you think taking a private caregiver along? Absolutely. If it's something that can be, if the resources allow it, I think it can be a nice way to, allow the family to be able to breathe and have a family experience without somebody feeling like they're not getting a vacation, if it's intergenerational travel. And I'll use this as an example. I just did a workshop on burnout. And in that workshop, we were talking about burnout and how the medical it's not a diagnosis, the medical perspective of burnout is specifically related to the workplace. But my scenario that I used as an example and said, how is this possible, was using my sister as an example. My mom, when she had stage 4 metastatic brain cancer, was on hospice living with my sister. And I was living in Germany. So I was not of any service to my sister other than to call. So my mom lived with my sister for 4 months in her final days, medical, using morphine or all the different things that hospice end of life comes with. My sister had 2 children under the age of, I think at that time it was like 5. And she was a full-time school teacher, and she's an elementary education teacher. So within the terms of burnout, if you look at the ICD-11, they would have only looked at her work environment for burnout. And so the question of, when did she ever stop working, right? She was in constant work and constant demands, whether from the children, the school that she taught at, or my mom. So if she goes on a vacation with my mom, and she went on vacations because I was out of the picture, I was overseas. So she's taking my mom in this state with her children and her husband. Do you think my sister had a vacation? I mean, absolutely no, because the whole time she's worrying that something's going to go wrong with my mom. And so I think that if the resources are available, I think it's a fantastic opportunity to allow everybody to have a more natural family experience. There could be people who disagree with me, but I know that within my sphere, the people that I've talked to, it tends to, the job of doing all this planning lands on the eldest and or the oldest daughter in a family. And in many cases, that individual has children. And so they're not just taking care of the elder, the senior, potentially, they're also taking care of their own family as well as their children. So I do like the idea of if there are services that would allow that to be able to do that. So I hope I answered your question on that. Within the how, we were talking about the different, apologies, just a moment. Like I said, I've been talking for 3 days now. When we start talking about how, and it's interesting because here we are at hurricane season. I'd like to walk people through some different scenarios, the what would I do if? And it's not to scare people away, but it is a proactive approach to managing risk, right? If you are traveling, what would you do if you became sick? What happens if you lost your identification? And that happens to everybody. My husband lost an ID at an airport, in the middle of a multi-day trip. If you lose your phone or credit card, are you separated? What if you got separated by your group? I was diving in the Galapagos when a dive didn't go quite right. And in that moment, I can remember being underwater. I was 75 feet underwater and there's 100 hammerheads, in this sharks in this ravine. And I wasn't worried about the sharks at all. In that one moment, I can remember if I don't stop this dive, my husband's going to spend a week trying to get my body back into the US. And so, everything went fine, but it was just a realization of being out of the country, out of the Galapagos, 20 hours by boat away from any kind of real support services. And, you have to be mindful of, the level of risk you can tolerate, where you are, your situational awareness, and then what would that, action strategy look like if you had to, reach out for services. And we don't often think about natural disasters and national crisis, but if you watch the news, it's interesting. Every once in a while, you'll hear of an earthquake or a volcano down in the Caribbean. You'll hear of a tsunami. You hear of, geopolitical instability that happens kind of suddenly. So it's not that we dwell a lot on this, but depending on, again, the individual traveler, I think it makes sense to work through who they are, what they bring to the table, what they understand and know, where they're going, and then just work out some of the things that are more likely to be a challenge. I mean, if you're not, like some of my travel is pretty extreme. And, as in the introduction, as a sailor, I have to be pretty self-sufficient at times. And so, yeah, my strategy thinking is definitely different than if I'm just, driving up to Connecticut where, I lose something along the way, I can pick up a phone or I can buy it. That's different than if you're out, at sea. And then these last, takeaways that I like to share, again, regardless, senior, wherever you are, I like to remind people, obviously what you bring, your baseline health and fitness, what you bring impacts how you live along the way. And so really striving to build that foundation. And if you could have seen Maggie this morning, I mean, I wouldn't have known she was 91. I don't know, I mean, sometimes I think I know what certain ages ranges, would look like, but she looked pretty darn good. She was spry. She was like tracking everything we talked about. I mean, there was no delay. And, but if you were to look at her, she looked like she was probably, within her ideal body weight range, as a clinician, I could, looking at that. She, was talking about being active, she was talking about the things that she does in her daily life. But you have to remember that, how we treat our bodies now, is how they have the ability to show up. And that doesn't mean that, if you've got mobility difficulties, or, being, that should limit you. But it is nice to be able to be at the best that we can, just so it makes things a little bit more seamless. I'd like to remind people, towards the bottom, this is where people say I can get a little Susie Thundercloud about stuff, when people are traveling. I know that people sometimes like to, celebrate a lot, but I do like to also remind folks that, alcohol, just to be mindful of how much you're drinking when you're out. Not only can that impact your health, wellness, your immune system, but also situational awareness when you're on the road. I think it makes sense to be a little bit more dialed in while you're traveling. And as a solo traveler, particularly, I like to remind people that you really do need to have a point person somewhere. You can be as independent as you want, and I love that. If you're out there, and more power to you. And if you don't want to use a point person, I get it. That's completely your choice. But I can tell you there is that risk that if, of not having someone know where you were. There are electronic services to upload documents. So like in an emergency, if you were a solo traveler and you had a heart attack and nobody would know who you were, and, that they didn't know maybe more about like your medical status, you can have those services, connected to your phone. But I think it just is a smart way to have a point person that can kind of keep up with, the basic logistics. I love that question, Rayanne. I'll get to that in just a moment, because I have a story about getting separated. It was pretty traumatic for everyone except for my mom. And then I also say over here, while traveling, just try to be mindful of, obviously when we're traveling, we want to have fun, but, sometimes we can be our own worst enemy. If you're not used to eating, street food out of food trucks, at home where your microbiome is aligned with your diet, dietary experiences. You go to a place, maybe Egypt, Thailand, the Philippines, and you see a food truck, I'm not saying that you would get sick. I'm not saying the food is bad. I'm just saying that you may not have the microbiome to be able to, enjoy that food the way that you would like. And so I like to remind folks to just be mindful of what they're doing, to try to continue to, be active. I don't tell folks to start exercise programs while they're traveling, because sometimes their immune system is a little stressed already. And so to kind of keep that, consistent. And you can see this, as well, just trying to reduce stress as you go, practice situational awareness, and then update that point person if needed. Now, the question that was asked in the chat, great question, Megan. I see that as well. And she's got my last slide right there. Rayanne asked about what kind of information you have with an elderly person you're traveling. What about if you get separated? So I mentioned I used to live in Germany. My husband was in the military. And the only time I ever saw that man worried, he was a pilot. He went, he served in Iraq. He came back. And the only time I ever saw that man stressed out was in Belgium at about 6, maybe 8 o'clock in the morning. And we were at an antique fair, and he comes like right up to me, his eyes, he's looking a little frantic, and he looks at me and he goes, "Where's your mom?" And I said, "Well, I thought mom was with you." Because I was window shopping or looking at a store or something. And he's like, "Well, I told her to stand at this light post, and I went back and she's not there." And in that moment, we're in Belgium. This is not Disney where we have gates and I can tell somebody, It's a Small World or the Haunted Mansion, my mom is somewhere in this park. Yeah, it was a little, it was, it was a little traumatic. We ended up finding her. We didn't know at the time she actually had brain cancer, and that's why she had wandered off. We actually thought it was a little bit of a chemo haze that she experienced from her treatment. But yeah, she wandered off. She didn't go far, but it really reminded me to make sure that if you're traveling with an older person, and there is this risk of getting separated, remember what people are wearing. Take a selfie in the morning with everybody. Make it fun. Don't be like, Mom, Dad, I got to know, make sure, I know what you're wearing, that be, put a name tag on you. I mean, because that's demeaning and we don't want to do that. We don't make a spectacle out of it. But take a selfie in the morning. Hey, everybody, we're getting ready to head out the door. Let's make this memory permanent. Take a picture. And then this way we have an idea of what everybody looks like that morning when we walked out the door. I also think that there are ways now digitally to use services. I know my sister still has her children on one of the 360 apps where, she knows where her son is. He's well into adulthood, and she tells him, look, you live alone. What if you had a medical emergency? I wouldn't know where you were. And so he allows himself to be tracked. I saw a commercial on TV the other day where it was like how to keep track of your family members or something. And it was the older daughter with her father, and the father had gone someplace because he had memories of where he used to sit with his wife on a park bench. So I think that it's a beautiful thing with technology is that we can pretty much track and that sounds not great to some of us, but there is a way to be able to do that. And I encourage that if you're in a situation where somebody could wander, because I tell you, my situation with my mom, this was, almost 15, 17 years ago, could have gone very, very wrong had we not found her as quickly. I think that also, just having some baseline information, whether you use it digitally or whether you're taking hard copies, where like what they look like, their baseline health status, have a copy of a passport, any kind of documents that you might have, maybe a copy of what their driver's license looks like. I think that could be very useful, because if you had to go to authorities, they're going to ask you for information. And if you have it readily available, but you could do this for everybody in your travel party too. And again, like I said, there's these online document services that you can have the app on your phone, and then you have a pass, like a code or a card that's in a wallet. And so the person that everybody could have that card as well. So if they got lost, they could give that card to, a medical provider or somebody in the authorities, and then they could look at that information up and potentially access different documents. But then you could also have something like that as well. So I do think that those are tools that are out there. Megan had asked, what should be in an emergency travel health kit? I think that this, where it is. I think this depends on where you're going. And so when we talk about those travel health kits or emergency kits, I think this goes back to the beginning where I was talking about, you really have to have a clear understanding of what the individual traveler is bringing to the table, right? What is their baseline health and wellness? If it's a person who's very healthy, you're traveling within the country that they're from, and we'll use the United States, I'm healthy, I'm within the United States, and, I'm in Connecticut, my first aid kit would look pretty basic, something for an allergy, something for congestion, Band-Aids, some kind of an antibiotic ointment of sorts. I don't take any medication, so I don't have any with me. You would plan to have, just some basics to be able to manage. I mean, there's a Walgreens 5 minutes away if I needed something. So I don't think of, having an extensive first aid kit. That could be very different if you had somebody that was with, on dialysis, or had, has an infection, or maybe is getting some kind of medication, via an IV, and you're having to go out of the country. First aid kits might be very different for that individual. There was a time when we were looking at traveling, and I can't remember where we were going, but if you were to look online at like the State Department and some of the websites that talk about traveling to whatever that country was, there was talk about traveling with your own medical syringes, because if you could not get to certain hospitals that were in the cities, and this was almost 20 years ago, but they may not have disposable syringes. And so making sure that you had your own needles, which I thought was, as a pharmacist, I was like, wow, that brings a whole nother level of complexity, because, I know that as a pharmacist, some places you can travel with certain medications, other places you can't. Different countries have different rules. And there's ways that you can find this out online through the state department. But, that also goes into what would it be in your first aid kit. And that can be very individualized. I have documents that I've shared with, people before and online that really goes into a very detailed list of, basic first aid kit versus a more comprehensive one. And it really just depends. I tend to look at allergies, congestion, cold, gastrointestinal illness, something like diarrhea. And then if it gets more complicated like that, like I have it right here next to me. You can't see it, but I have my water bottle, and this one has a filter in it. So even though I'm in the US and I'm traveling to a place I used to, I'm filtering my water, and it's all in a contained bottle. Just because, you go to different places, I can drink water that I know that goes through charcoal, that I have a lower risk, at least with the water, of being exposed to something that I might not react well to. And then, of course, on this slide, there's the first aid kits. I talk about medication safety. I briefly mentioned that, depending again on who the person is and the complexity of their care, having an up-to-date med list, having that document backed up somewhere so that you could access it. In some countries, you may need hard copies of prescriptions. I was reading online at the State Department at one point that, a couple of countries, depending on the type of drug, I think it was opioids, that you might be asked, I guess if they knew you were coming in with opioids, to do a pill count when you went into the country and out of the country. I was like, good grief, who does that? But, if they're worried about you, I could see, them worrying, I guess, about diversion or selling opioids, maybe, illegally. But what if you're a person with cancer, and you're using opioids for chronic pain? That's a level of complexity you might not have planned for. Some countries, if you're going to be in the country long term, they make you have medical insurance or have a doctor in that country. And these rules can, from what I can tell, they can change a lot. So I don't typically speak specifically, but yeah, it can be pretty complicated. Personal security is another thing to consider. And then travel insurance, and that's its own conversation, because there's a big difference between trip insurance, travel health insurance, emergency evacuation insurance. As a diver and sailor, when I'm diving, I have dive insurance that, if I have a dive related injury, out of the country, I can kick it in, and it doesn't help me pay while I'm there. But, if I'm injured by the physical act of diving, I don't have to worry about my medical insurance saying, oh, well, maybe you shouldn't have been doing that. My dive insurance is something that I have on the side that's like, oh, so you were diving. Okay. And then they also have a physician line of people that know about dive related injuries, so that if I'm, in a country like Costa Rica or Honduras or something, although oftentimes there are scuba aware medical providers, I can call into a number in the United States and get somebody that's down, typically out of North Carolina, Duke, where they do a lot of dive research. And a physician could talk to a doctor there in the country that I'm at, and explain to them, yeah, this is what we would do for dive-related injuries. So you can get pretty specific sometimes with the travel insurances. So that's about all I have for you guys. I wanted to stop. I know I'm almost out of time. Any other questions? Apologies, I almost went a little longer than I thought I should have. Let me stop sharing.
Andrea, that was some great information. Folks, we are pushing close to 2 o'clock, so I ask if you have any other questions, please put them in the chat box. I hope that you are all planning some adventure. I really appreciated you just kind of teasing out, it doesn't have to be a grand plan or a far-flung adventure. Sometimes just a drive through the battlefield or a trip for ice cream can be considered travel and can be fun.
Mm-hmm.
Find
Absolutely.
the fun in the moment. Excellent. All right, everybody. Well, Andrea, thank you very much for being with us today. I wish you safe travels as you head back south.
Yes.
Folks, our next webinar is August 10th. We are still working out the details on that one, so stay tuned. There'll be more information coming. And I wish you all a great day. I hope you plan some kind of travel adventure soon. And we look forward to seeing you again in August. Andrea, thank you again.
It was my pleasure. I'm so happy I could have been here.
And let me just point out, we've put up a slide. We have the contact information and Dr. Leschak's website and email. If you want more information or want to learn about her services, you can find her there. Thank you
so much.
Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.
All right, we're clear.